The scream that tore through the Colorado wilderness in the autumn of 1878 belonged to a woman who had never known true fear until that moment. Zelda Ashford stumbled through the dense pine forest, her traveling dress torn and mudded, her hands bleeding from where she had clawed at branches and rocks in her desperate attempt to find any trace of the trail she had been following just hours before. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her like skeletal fingers, and the temperature was dropping fast. She had been so confident when she left Cannon City that morning, convinced she could find the shortcut to the neighboring settlement that the shopkeeper had mentioned. She had been wrong. Terribly, fatally wrong. Her breathing came in ragged gasps as she pressed on, knowing that stopping meant freezing to death once night fell completely. The Rocky Mountains were unforgiving in October, and she wore only a thin wool shawl over her dress. Her reticule, which had contained her small pistol and what little money she possessed, had been lost somewhere behind her when she had slipped down an embankment. Now she had nothing but her wits and her failing strength. Zelda collapsed against a massive pine tree, her legs finally giving out. Tears streamed down her face, though she tried to hold them back. She was 22 years old, a schoolteacher who had traveled west from Boston to start a new life after her father's death had left her alone and nearly penniless. She had made it all the way to Colorado Territory, had secured a position at the small school in Cannon City, and now she was going to die in these mountains before she even taught her first lesson. That was when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Her head jerked up, hope and terror warring in her chest. In these parts, a stranger could be salvation or doom. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, her throat raw from screaming and crying. She attempted to stand, using the tree for support, and managed to get to her feet just as a rider appeared through the trees. The man sat astride a sturdy buckskin horse, and even in the fading light, Zelda could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He reined in his horse the moment he spotted her, his body going still in that particular way that spoke of a man assessing potential danger. "Help me," Zelda managed to croak out, her hand still gripping the tree trunk. "Please." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He approached cautiously, and as he drew nearer, Zelda could make out more of his features. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble, weathered skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors, and eyes that were a striking shade of blue-green, like the mountain lakes she had glimpsed on her journey west. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that held a note of concern. "You hurt?" "Lost," she gasped. "I've been lost since noon. I can't find the trail. I don't know where I am." He closed the remaining distance between them and caught her elbow as her knees buckled again. His grip was firm but gentle, and Zelda found herself leaning against him, too exhausted to maintain propriety. "Easy now," he said. "I've got you. Name's Owen Whitmore. I've got a cabin about 2 miles north of here. Can you ride?" "I think so," Zelda said, though she was not sure of anything anymore. Owen guided her to his horse with steady hands. The buckskin stood patient and calm as Owen lifted Zelda into the saddle with surprising ease. She clutched at the saddle horn, swaying slightly, and then Owen swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. The warmth of his body against her back was immediate and blessed, and Zelda felt some of the panic that had been choking her begin to ease. "Hold on," Owen said, and he urged the horse forward at a careful walk, navigating through the darkening forest with the confidence of a man who knew every tree and stone. Zelda wanted to ask him questions, wanted to know who he was and why he was out here alone, but exhaustion was crashing over her in waves. Her head drooped forward, and she felt Owen's arm tighten around her waist, holding her secure. "Stay with me," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Just a bit longer now." She forced her eyes to stay open, watching as the forest gradually thinned and gave way to a clearing. A cabin stood silhouetted against the last light of the setting sun, solid and well-built, with smoke rising from its chimney. A small barn sat nearby, and Zelda could see the shapes of other horses in a corral. Owen brought his horse to a halt near the cabin's front porch and dismounted, then reached up to help Zelda down. Her legs nearly gave out again, but he caught her, one arm behind her knees and the other supporting her back, and he lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. "I can walk," she protested weakly, but he was already carrying her up the porch steps. "Maybe so, but you do not need to," he replied. He managed to open the door while still holding her and carried her inside. The cabin's interior was warm and surprisingly tidy. A fire burned in a stone fireplace, and Zelda glimpsed simple but sturdy furniture, shelves lined with books, and the general organization of a man who took care of his space. Owen set her down gently in a chair near the fire and immediately went to work stoking the flames higher. "You need to get warm," he said. "When's the last time you ate or drank anything?" Zelda had to think about it. "I had some water from my canteen around midday. I ate breakfast before I left town." Owen's jaw tightened, but he did not comment on her foolishness. Instead, he moved to a cabinet and retrieved a tin cup, which he filled with water from a pitcher. He brought it to her, pressing it into her shaking hands. "Drink slowly," he instructed. The water was cold and clean, and it soothed her raw throat. Zelda drank half the cup before lowering it, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must look. Her dark hair had come completely loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress was ruined, torn and stained with mud and pine sap. Her hands were filthy and scratched. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not found me." "You would have frozen," Owen said bluntly. He was at the stove now, moving with the easy competence of a man accustomed to caring for himself. "These mountains are not forgiving, especially not this time of year. What were you doing out there alone?" Shame heated Zelda's cheeks. "I thought I could find a shortcut." "The man at the general store in Cannon City mentioned a trail, and I thought I could save time by taking it instead of waiting for the stage. I wanted to see if the schoolhouse needed any preparations before Monday." Owen glanced over his shoulder at her. "You are the new school teacher." "Yes." "Zelda Ashford. I arrived in Cannon City 3 days ago." He turned back to the stove, and Zelda thought she detected a hint of amusement in his voice when he spoke. "The shortcut old Pete mentioned runs about 5 miles east of here. You got yourself turned around good." Zelda closed her eyes, fresh tears threatening. She had been so lost, so far from where she thought she was. Owen must think her a complete fool. "Hey," Owen said, and she opened her eyes to find him crouched in front of her chair, those striking eyes searching her face. "You are safe now. That is what matters. Tomorrow I will take you back to town. Tonight, you rest and get your strength back." His kindness, after such a terrifying day, was nearly her undoing. Zelda felt tears slip down her cheeks despite her best efforts to contain them. Owen's expression softened, and he reached out to gently brush the tears away with his thumb, the gesture so tender that it made her heart ache. "You are all right," he said quietly. "I promise." Zelda nodded, not trusting her voice. Owen held her gaze for a moment longer, then stood and returned to the stove. He ladled what smelled like venison stew into a bowl and brought it to her along with a spoon. "Eat," he said. "You will feel better with something warm in you." The stew was simple but delicious, rich and hearty, and Zelda realized she was ravenous. She ate every bite while Owen moved around the cabin, giving her space. He went outside briefly and returned with his saddlebags, which he set near the door. Then he poured himself some coffee and settled into a chair on the opposite side of the fireplace, watching the flames rather than staring at her. "You live up here alone?" Zelda asked when she had finished eating. "Mostly," Owen replied. "I run cattle in the lower valleys and trap in the winter. The solitude suits me. You go into Cannon City often, once a month or so for supplies. I keep to myself otherwise." Zelda studied him in the firelight. He had removed his hat, revealing hair the color of dark honey that was slightly too long, curling at his collar. His features were strong and handsome in a rugged way, but it was his eyes that captivated her. They held a depth of experience that suggested he had seen much in his life, both good and bad. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 5 years. "I came out from Wyoming Territory looking for a fresh start." He glanced at her. "Seems we have that in common." "Yes," Zelda said softly. "I suppose we do." Owen stood and went to a chest in the corner of the room. He pulled out a heavy quilt and brought it to her. "You should rest." "You can take the bed. I will sleep out here." "I cannot take your bed," Zelda protested, but Owen was already shaking his head. "You are my guest, and you have been through an ordeal. The bed is yours tonight." He gestured to a doorway that led to what she assumed was the bedroom. "There is a basin and pitcher in there if you want to wash up. I will be right out here if you need anything." Zelda accepted the quilt, her fingers brushing his as she took it. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, something beyond the physical heat of the fire. She stood on unsteady legs, and Owen immediately moved to her side, offering his arm for support. "I am all right," she said, but she did not pull away from his steadying presence as he walked her to the bedroom door. The room was small but clean, with a simple bed covered in wool blankets, a dresser, and a washstand. Owen lit a lamp on the dresser, and the golden light filled the space with warmth. "Sleep as late as you need," he said. "The door latches from the inside if it makes you feel safer." Zelda looked up at him, this stranger who had saved her life and was now offering her nothing but kindness and respect. "I am not afraid of you," she said, and she realized it was true. Something flickered in Owen's eyes, an emotion she could not quite name. He nodded once, then stepped back into the main room, pulling the door partially closed to give her privacy. Zelda stood in the center of the small room for a long moment, the events of the day finally catching up with her. She washed her face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher, wincing as it stung her scratches. She could do nothing about her ruined dress, so she simply removed her torn petticoats and her boots, then climbed into the bed in her chemise and the outer dress. The mattress was stuffed with what felt like corn husks and pine needles, but after a day of walking and running through the forest, it felt like the finest hotel bed. Zelda pulled the heavy quilts up to her chin and closed her eyes, listening to the quiet sounds of Owen moving around in the other room. She heard him banking the fire, the soft thud of his boots being removed, the creak of the chair as he settled into it. She should have been too frightened to sleep, too aware of her vulnerable position, alone in a mountain cabin with a man she had just met. But something about Owen Whitmore made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her father's death. As exhaustion pulled her under, her last conscious thought was that she had been lost, but perhaps she had also been found. Zelda woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sunlight streamed through the small window, and for a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Then memory returned and she sat up quickly, her hands going to her tangled hair. She could hear Owen moving around in the main room, and she could see through the partially open door that he was at the stove, his back to her. Zelda climbed out of bed and did her best to make herself presentable, using her fingers to comb through her hair and then braiding it into a simple plait. Her dress looked even worse in the daylight, but there was nothing to be done about it. She pushed the door open fully and stepped into the main room. Owen turned at the sound, and his eyes did a quick sweep over her before returning to her face. "Morning," he said. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I had any right to, considering," Zelda replied honestly. "Thank you again for your hospitality." "No thanks needed." He gestured to the table, which was set with 2 plates. "Breakfast is almost ready. There is coffee in the pot if you want some." Zelda poured herself a cup of the strong, dark coffee and sat down at the table. Owen joined her a moment later with a skillet containing bacon and eggs, which he divided between their plates. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Owen spoke. "I will saddle up after we eat and take you back to Cannon City. It is about a 3-hour ride from here if we take the direct route." "You do not have to do that," Zelda said, though she felt a pang of disappointment at the thought of leaving. "If you could just point me in the right direction." "I am taking you," Owen interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "You are not wandering these mountains alone again." Zelda felt her cheeks warm, both from the memory of her foolishness and from the protective note in his voice. "I truly am grateful," she said softly. "I shudder to think what might have happened if you had not come along when you did." Owen's expression grew serious. "What made you come west alone, Miss Ashford? Seems like a risky venture for a woman on her own." Zelda wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, drawing strength from its warmth. "My father passed away 6 months ago. He was a professor at a college in Boston, and we lived comfortably enough, but it turned out he had debts I did not know about. After they were settled, there was nothing left. I had no other family, and the positions available to me in Boston were limited. Then I saw an advertisement for a schoolteacher needed in Cannon City, Colorado Territory, and it seemed like a sign, a chance to start fresh somewhere new." "That took courage," Owen said, and there was respect in his voice. "Or desperation," Zelda replied with a wry smile. "Though after yesterday I am beginning to question my judgment. Yesterday was a mistake, but you survived it. That counts for something." Owen finished his coffee and stood. "I will get the horses ready. You take your time finishing up." He went outside, and Zelda sat alone in the quiet cabin, looking around at the space that had sheltered her. Everything about it spoke of a man who valued function and self-sufficiency, but there were small touches that surprised her. The books on the shelves were well-worn volumes of poetry and literature, not just practical manuals. A small sketch tacked to the wall showed the mountain vista with remarkable skill. A harmonica sat on the mantel above the fireplace. Owen Whitmore was clearly more than just a rough mountain man, and Zelda found herself curious about him in a way that went beyond simple gratitude for her rescue. When she stepped outside onto the porch, she got her first good look at the surrounding landscape in daylight. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with the mountains rising majestically in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. A clear stream ran nearby, its water sparkling in the morning sun. It was beautiful and wild and utterly isolated. Owen had saddled 2 horses, his buckskin and a smaller bay mare. He looked up as Zelda descended the porch steps, and she saw him take in her appearance in the daylight. She must look a fright, but his expression showed only concern, no judgment. "This is Copper," he said, indicating the mare. "She is gentle and sure-footed. She will get you down the mountain safely." Owen helped Zelda mount, his hands steady on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. Once she was settled, He swung up onto his own horse with that same easy grace she had noticed the night before. He took the lead, setting a careful pace that allowed the horses to navigate the rocky terrain safely. As they rode, Owen pointed out landmarks and explained the geography, showing Zelda where she had gone wrong the day before. She listened intently, determined to learn from her mistake. The morning air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the earthy smell of the forest floor. Birds called from the trees, and once they spotted a small herd of elk in the distance. "It is beautiful up here," Zelda said as they paused to let the horses drink from a stream. "Lonely, though." Owen looked out over the landscape, his expression thoughtful. "I used to think lonely and alone were the same thing. Took me a while to learn the difference. And which is it for you?" He turned those blue-green eyes on her, and Zelda felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. "It was alone by choice, but lonely," he paused, "maybe more than I wanted to admit." The honesty of his answer touched something deep inside Zelda. She wanted to ask him more, to understand what had driven him to seek solitude in these mountains. But he was already moving on, clearly not comfortable with revealing too much. They rode in silence for a while longer, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Zelda found herself watching Owen as he rode ahead of her, noting the confident way he sat his horse, the easy strength in his movements. He had saved her life, and she barely knew him, yet she felt drawn to him in a way that both excited and frightened her. As they descended from the higher elevations, the landscape began to change. The dense pine forest gave way to more open areas with scrub brush and scattered trees. In the distance, Zelda could see the faint outline of buildings that marked Cannon City. "Almost there," Owen said, and Zelda was surprised by the disappointment that washed over her. She was not ready for this journey to end, not ready to say goodbye to this man who had appeared in her darkest moment like some kind of guardian angel. As they rode into the outskirts of Cannon City, curious eyes watched them. Zelda was acutely aware of how they must look, her in her ruined dress and Owen looking like the mountain man he was. They drew to a halt in front of the small boarding house where Zelda had taken a room, and Owen dismounted, then came to help her down. His hands circled her waist, and he lifted her from the saddle, setting her gently on the ground. But instead of immediately releasing her, he held on for a moment, looking down into her face. "You will be all right now?" he asked. "Yes," Zelda said, though she felt anything but certain. "Thanks to you." Owen stepped back, his hands falling away, and Zelda immediately missed their warmth. He gathered Copper's reins and handed them to a boy who had appeared, offering him a coin to take the mare to the livery. "Owen," Zelda said, before she could lose her courage, "will I see you again?" His expression was unreadable. "I come to town for supplies sometimes." That was not really an answer. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him. "No, I suppose it was not." He studied her for a long moment. "I do not know if it is a good idea, Miss Ashford. I am not exactly town folk." "Neither am I, apparently," Zelda replied, "or I would not have gotten myself so thoroughly lost." Owen's smile widened slightly. "You have spirit, I will give you that." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell. "Take care of yourself, schoolteacher." He turned and walked toward his horse, and Zelda felt a surge of panic at the thought of him simply riding away. "Owen, wait," she called. He turned back, one hand on his saddle. "Sunday," Zelda said quickly. "There is a church service on Sunday mornings. Will you come?" Owen looked at her for a long moment, and Zelda held her breath, waiting. Finally, he nodded once. "I will think about it." It was not a promise, but it was not a refusal either. Zelda had to be content with that. She watched as Owen mounted his horse and rode back out of town, heading toward his mountain sanctuary. Even after he had disappeared from view, she stood there, her heart full of confused feelings she could not quite name. The boarding house mistress, Mrs. Henderson, appeared on the porch, her expression a mixture of shock and concern. "Miss Ashford, what on earth happened to you? We thought you had taken ill when you did not return last night." Zelda turned to face the older woman, suddenly aware of the spectacle she must present. "I got lost in the mountains. Mr. Whitmore found me and gave me shelter for the night, then brought me back this morning." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed with speculation. "Owen Whitmore, was it? That man is practically a hermit, keeps to himself up in those mountains." "He was a perfect gentleman," Zelda said firmly. "He saved my life." The older woman's expression softened. "Well, come inside then, dear. You need a proper bath and some clean clothes, and then you are going to tell me the whole story." Over the next few hours, Zelda endured Mrs. Henderson's fussing, grateful for the hot bath and the loan of a dress while hers was being repaired. She recounted her ordeal, though she found herself glossing over certain details, particularly the moments of quiet intimacy she had shared with Owen. Those felt too personal, too precious to share with the gossipy boarding house mistress. By Sunday morning, Zelda had settled into a routine. She had spent Friday preparing the small schoolhouse for Monday's classes, and Saturday had been devoted to meeting some of the families whose children she would be teaching. Cannon City was a small but growing town, benefiting from its position near the Arkansas River and the mining operations in the surrounding areas. The people were friendly but reserved, as frontier folk often were, waiting to see if the new schoolteacher would last before fully accepting her. Zelda dressed carefully for church in her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her dark hair up neatly and added her mother's cameo brooch, one of the few pieces of jewelry she had kept. As she walked to the small church with Mrs. Henderson, her eyes scanned the people gathered outside, looking for a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat. Her heart sank when she did not see him. Of course Owen had not come. Why would he? He had made it clear he preferred his solitude, and she had been foolish to hope that one chance encounter would change that. The service began, and Zelda tried to focus on the minister's words, but her attention kept drifting to the door. Halfway through the sermon, it opened quietly, and Owen Whitmore slipped inside, removing his hat as he did so. He had cleaned up, his face freshly shaven, his hair neatly combed, wearing what were clearly his town clothes, though they looked slightly uncomfortable on his frame. His eyes scanned the congregation and found Zelda immediately. Something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that made Zelda's heart leap in her chest. Owen found a spot at the back of the church, and Zelda forced herself to turn her attention back to the minister, though she was intensely aware of Owen's presence behind her for the remainder of the service. When it ended, Zelda stood with the other congregants, moving slowly toward the door where the minister stood greeting people. She was acutely aware of the curious glances being cast her way, and she realized word of her rescue had spread through the small community. By the time she reached the door, Owen was nowhere to be seen, and disappointment crashed over her once again. She stepped outside into the bright morning sunshine and nearly collided with him. He was standing just to the side of the church steps, his hat in his hands, clearly waiting. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice formal in the public setting. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. "You came." "I did." He glanced around at the people watching them with undisguised interest. "Would you care to take a walk? Seems like we have an audience here." "I would like that very much." Owen offered his arm, and Zelda took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her hand. They walked away from the church, heading toward the river that ran along the edge of town. Behind them, Zelda could hear the whispers starting, but she found she did not care. "I was not sure you would come," she admitted once they were out of earshot of the others. "I was not sure either," Owen replied. "I spent the week trying to talk myself out of it." "What changed your mind?" He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I could not stop thinking about you, wondering if you were all right, if you were settling in. It seemed easier to come see for myself than to keep wondering." His honesty made Zelda's heart race. "I am glad you did. I have been thinking about you too." They reached the riverbank and stood watching the water flow past, carrying leaves and small branches in its current. Owen still had not released her arm, and Zelda made no move to pull away. "This is dangerous," Owen said quietly. "What is this?" "Whatever this is between us. I am not the kind of man a woman like you should be interested in." Zelda turned to face him fully. "What kind of man are you, Owen?" He met her gaze, and she saw conflict in his eyes. "The kind who ran away from his past instead of facing it. The kind who has spent 5 years hiding in the mountains because it was easier than being around people who knew what I did." "What did you do?" Owen looked away, his jaw tight. "I was a soldier once, cavalry. I served in the Indian Wars, and I did things I am not proud of. Things I cannot take back or make right. When my enlistment ended, I could not go back to civilization and pretend to be normal. So I came here, as far from everything as I could get." Zelda absorbed this information, seeing the pain in his face. "We all have things in our past we wish we could change," she said softly. "I was not honest with you about my father's death. He did die, but it was not just debts he left behind. He took his own life when he realized how bad things had gotten financially. I found him. And I ran away too, all the way to Colorado Territory, because I could not bear to stay in a place where everyone knew what had happened." Owen looked at her with new understanding. "I am sorry. That must have been terrible." "It was. But hiding from it does not make it go away. The pain follows wherever we go." She reached out and touched his hand. "Maybe we are both tired of running." His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "What are you saying, Zelda?" "I am saying that I would like to get to know you better. Not as my rescuer, but as a man. As someone who might understand what it is like to be starting over." "I do not come to town often," Owen warned. "My life is up in those mountains. It is hard and isolated. I know, but you are here now." A slow smile spread across Owen's face, transforming his features and making him look younger, less burdened. "I am here now," he agreed. They stood there by the river, hands clasped, both of them aware they were stepping into unknown territory. But for the first time since her father's death, Zelda felt something beyond grief and fear. She felt hope. Over the following weeks, Owen began coming to town more frequently. At first it was just on Sundays for church, and then he started finding other reasons, small errands that brought him down from his mountain cabin. He would stop by the schoolhouse, often arriving just as Zelda was dismissing her students for the day. The children were fascinated by the tall mountain man, and he proved surprisingly patient with their endless questions about his horses and the wildlife he encountered. Zelda found herself living for these visits. Owen would walk her back to the boarding house, and they would talk about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood in Wyoming, about the parents he had lost to influenza when he was 16, about the aimless years that followed before he joined the cavalry. She told him about growing up in Boston, about her love of books and learning, about the dreams she had harbored before her father's death had changed everything. One crisp November afternoon, Owen arrived at the schoolhouse with a proposition. "It is Saturday tomorrow," he said. "And I was thinking, if you are willing, maybe you could come up to the cabin again. In the daylight this time, without the panic and fear. I could show you the country properly." Zelda's heart leaped at the invitation. I would love that, but people will talk. Let them talk. Unless it bothers you, she thought about the scandal it might cause. An unmarried woman spending a day unchaperoned with an unmarried man. But then she looked into Owen's eyes and saw the hope there, and she realized she did not care what the gossips might say. It does not bother me if it does not bother you, she said. Owen's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Then I will pick you up at first light. Dress warm and wear practical clothes if you have them. The next morning, Zelda was waiting on the boarding house porch when Owen rode up leading Copper, the gentle bay mare. Mrs. Henderson had clucked disapprovingly when Zelda announced her plans, but she had not forbidden it. Zelda had the sense that the older woman secretly approved of the match, even if she had to maintain appearances. The ride up to the cabin took less time than Zelda remembered from her desperate flight down. With Owen leading the way and pointing out landmarks, she began to understand the geography of the area. She was determined never to get lost here again. When they reached the cabin, Owen helped her down from the saddle, his hands lingering on her waist just a moment longer than necessary. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, and Zelda felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Come on," Owen said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "I want to show you something." He led her past the cabin and up a narrow trail that climbed through the trees. It was a steep walk, and Zelda was breathing hard by the time they reached the top, but when she saw what Owen had brought her to see, the exertion was worth it. They stood on an outcropping of rock that overlooked the entire valley. Below them, the forest stretched out in a patchwork of evergreen and the gold and red of changing aspens. In the distance, Cannon City was visible as a small cluster of buildings. And beyond it all, the mountains rose in magnificent peaks, their snow-covered summits brilliant against the deep blue sky. "Oh, Owen," Zelda breathed, "it is beautiful." "I come up here when I need to think," Owen said, standing close beside her. "It helps me remember there is more to the world than my own troubles." They stood in silence for a while, just taking in the view. Then Owen reached down and took Zelda's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. The gesture was becoming familiar, natural, and Zelda squeezed his hand in response. "Zelda," Owen said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, concerned by his tone. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know I am not the kind of man you probably imagined for yourself. But I cannot deny what I feel anymore. You have brought something back into my life that I thought I had lost forever." Zelda's breath caught in her throat. "What did I bring back? Hope, joy, a reason to want tomorrow to come." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give, but I needed you to know how I feel." Tears stung Zelda's eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "Owen, I am falling in love with you too. I think I started that first night when you were so kind to me even though I was a stranger. No one has made me feel the way you do, safe and seen and valued." Owen lifted one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "You are all of those things. You are brave and intelligent and beautiful, and you deserve everything good this world has to offer." "I want you," Zelda whispered. "That is what I want." Owen's eyes darkened with emotion and he leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Zelda did not want to pull away. She rose on her toes to meet him, and when their lips touched, it was like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the taste and feel of each other. But then Owen's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Zelda's hands slid up to tangle in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of all the loneliness they had both carried, and the promise of never having to carry it alone again. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I know I have little to offer you but a mountain cabin and a hard life, but marry me, Zelda. Let me spend the rest of my days making you happy." Zelda's heart felt like it might burst. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Owen, I will marry you." He kissed her again, and then he was spinning her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his face was transformed with happiness, all the shadows temporarily banished. They stayed on the mountain for hours, talking and planning and stealing kisses whenever the urge struck them. Owen showed her his traps and taught her how to read the signs of game in the forest. Zelda told him about her students and her dreams of expanding the school's library. They talked about where they would live and decided that the cabin would be their home, at least for now, with Zelda making the ride down to teach during the school term. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Owen reluctantly said they should head back to town. "I do not want to damage your reputation any more than necessary," he said. "Though I suppose getting engaged to a mountain hermit has already done that." "I do not care about my reputation," Zelda said, "but I do care about doing this right. Let us talk to the minister tomorrow. We can be married before Thanksgiving." "That soon? Why wait? We both know what we want." Owen pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You are going to be the best thing that ever happened to me, Zelda Ashford." "Zelda Whitmore," she corrected with a smile. "I like the sound of that." The ride back to Cannon City was taken at a leisurely pace, neither of them wanting the day to end. By the time they reached the boarding house, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Owen helped Zelda dismount, then walked her to the door, still holding her hand. "Tomorrow," he said. "After church, we will talk to Reverend Matthews." "Tomorrow," Zelda agreed. He kissed her one more time, a sweet, lingering kiss that promised forever, and then he was gone, riding back into the night toward his mountain home. Zelda stood on the porch for a long time, watching until even the sound of hoofbeats had faded. Then she went inside, where Mrs. Henderson was waiting with undisguised curiosity. "Well," the older woman demanded. "What happened?" Zelda could not contain her smile. "We are getting married, Mrs." Henderson's eyes went wide, and then she was pulling Zelda into a hug, laughing and crying at the same time. "Oh, my dear girl, this is wonderful news. Owen Whitmore is a good man, even if he is a bit rough around the edges. When? Before Thanksgiving, if Reverend Matthews will agree to it." "That is barely 3 weeks away, I know. But why wait when we are both certain?" Mrs. Henderson pulled back, studying Zelda's face. "You are certain? You have only known him a few weeks." "I am certain," Zelda said firmly. "He is the one, Mrs. Henderson. I feel it in my bones." The older woman's expression softened. "Then I am happy for you, dear. Truly happy. Lord knows you both deserve some joy after the sorrows you have carried." News of the engagement spread through Cannon City like wildfire. By Monday morning, when Zelda arrived at the schoolhouse, she was met with knowing smiles and congratulations from the parents dropping off their children. Some expressed concern about her planning to live so far from town, but most seemed genuinely pleased that the new schoolteacher had found love. Owen came to town every day that week, helping Zelda prepare for their wedding and their life together. They met with Reverend Matthews, who agreed to perform the ceremony on the Saturday before Thanksgiving. The minister was an old circuit rider who had seen enough of frontier life to be practical about such things. If two people found each other and wanted to marry, he was not going to stand in their way over conventions. Zelda used some of her meager savings to purchase fabric for a new dress, a simple but pretty green wool that would be practical for mountain life. Mrs. Henderson and some of the other women in town helped her sew it, turning the work into a celebration. Owen, meanwhile, spent his time preparing the cabin for its new occupant, building additional shelves and storage, and making sure they had enough supplies to last through the winter. The night before the wedding, as Zelda lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house for the last time, she thought about how much her life had changed in just 2 months. She had come to Colorado Territory alone and frightened, with nothing but her teaching certificate and a desperate hope for a new start. She had gotten lost in the wilderness and found something she had not even known she was looking for. Owen Whitmore was not the sophisticated Boston gentleman her mother had probably imagined for her. He was rough and scarred and carried his own burdens. But he was also kind and strong and honest, and he loved her with an intensity that took her breath away. Tomorrow she would become his wife, and the thought filled her with joy rather than fear. The wedding was a small affair held in the church with perhaps 20 people in attendance. Zelda wore her new green dress with her mother's cameo, and she carried a small bouquet of the last wildflowers Owen had managed to find in the high country. Owen wore a new shirt and vest, his hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and when Zelda walked down the aisle toward him, the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know about his feelings. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony simple and brief, as frontier weddings often were. Owen's voice was steady and sure as he spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish Zelda for the rest of his days. Zelda's voice trembled slightly with emotion as she made her own promises, but her conviction was clear. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, and told Owen he could kiss his bride, Owen pulled Zelda into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of several watching women. As they turned to face their small gathering of well-wishers, Zelda felt a completeness she had never experienced before. She was no longer alone. She was home. The townspeople had organized a simple reception at the boarding house, with cake and cider and plenty of good wishes. Owen endured the socializing with good grace, though Zelda could see he was eager to leave. As the afternoon wore on, they made their farewells, accepting gifts of preserves and blankets and practical items for their household. Finally, with the sun beginning its descent toward the mountains, Owen helped Zelda onto Copper's back, then mounted his own horse. Zelda's few possessions had been packed into saddlebags and tied onto the horses. She took one last look at Cannon City, the town that had been her refuge, and then turned her face toward the mountains and her new life. The ride to the cabin was peaceful, the late November air crisp and cold but not yet bitter. Owen reached over several times to take Zelda's hand, just to touch her, to reassure himself she was real. When the cabin came into view, Zelda felt a surge of affection for the simple structure that was now her home. Owen dismounted and came to help Zelda down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her up into his arms. "I believe there is a tradition about carrying the bride over the threshold," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I believe you are right," Zelda replied, laughing as she wrapped her arms around his neck. Owen carried her up the porch steps and into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them. He set her down gently in front of the fireplace, which was already burning cheerfully, filling the space with warmth and light. Zelda looked around and saw that Owen had decorated the cabin with pine boughs and the last of the autumn leaves, making it festive for their arrival. "Owen, it is beautiful," she said. "Not as beautiful as you," he replied, pulling her close. "Mrs. Whitmore." "I like the sound of that," Zelda said, rising on her toes to kiss him. The kiss quickly deepened, All the anticipation and desire of the past weeks finally allowed free rein. Owen's hands moved to the buttons of her dress, and Zelda helped him, both of them fumbling slightly in their eagerness. When they finally tumbled into the bed in the small bedroom, skin against skin, heart against heart, it was with a sense of rightness that transcended the physical. Owen was gentle and patient, mindful of Zelda's inexperience, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, it was with a completeness that left them both trembling. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, listening to the wind whisper through the pines outside. "Are you happy?" Owen asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Zelda's bare shoulder. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Zelda replied honestly. "Are you?" "More than I deserve to be," Owen said. "You have given me back my life, Zelda. Before you, I was just existing. Now I am living again." Zelda turned in his arms to face him. "You saved my life that day in the woods. It seems only fair that I return the favor." Owen kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "We saved each other," he said. "And I promise you, I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a mountain hermit." "I could never regret this," Zelda whispered. "You are my home now, Owen. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." They made love again as the night deepened, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal passion. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside the cabin, two hearts that had been lost and lonely finally found their way to each other, and the future stretched before them full of promise. The winter that followed was the happiest time Zelda had ever known. She continued to teach 3 days a week, making the ride down to Cannon City on Monday mornings and returning to the cabin on Wednesday afternoons. Owen would meet her at a predetermined spot on the trail, unwilling to let her make even part of the journey alone. The other days of the week, Zelda threw herself into making the cabin a true home. She reorganized the space, adding curtains she sewed from fabric scraps and arranging their combined books on the shelves. She learned to cook on the wood stove, with Owen patiently teaching her how to make stews and biscuits and the other simple but hearty foods that sustained them. She proved surprisingly adept at preserving meat and vegetables, a necessary skill for surviving the mountain winters. In turn, Owen showed her the wilderness that surrounded their home. He taught her to read animal tracks in the snow, to identify edible plants, to understand the changing weather patterns. He showed her his trap lines and explained how he made his living from the furs he sold. Zelda proved an eager student, and Owen delighted in her quick mind and her willingness to learn. Their evenings were spent in front of the fire, with Zelda often reading aloud from their books while Owen worked on mending tack or carving. Sometimes Owen would take out his harmonica and play, the mournful yet beautiful melodies filling the cabin with music. And always, they talked, sharing their thoughts and dreams and fears, building the foundation of understanding that would sustain them through all the years to come. As winter deepened and the snow piled high around the cabin, Zelda found she did not miss the civilized comforts of her Boston upbringing. She had everything she needed in this mountain refuge: a warm home, meaningful work, and a man who loved her with his whole heart. In early February, Zelda began to suspect she was pregnant. She said nothing to Owen at first, wanting to be certain, but when 2 more weeks passed without her monthly courses, she could no longer deny the truth. One evening, as they sat together before the fire, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "Owen," she said softly, "I think we are going to have a baby." Owen's eyes went wide with shock, and then a smile of pure joy spread across his face. "A baby, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," But yes, I think so, probably sometime in early September. Owen pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. A child, he whispered. Our child. Zelda, you have made me the happiest man alive. You are happy about it then? I know we did not plan, happy does not begin to cover it, Owen interrupted. This is everything I never dared to dream of. A wife I adore, a child on the way, a life worth living. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. Thank you. I did not do it alone, Zelda said, laughing through happy tears. Over the following weeks, Owen became almost comically protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the cabin, would barely let Zelda lift anything heavier than a book, and fretted constantly about her health and comfort. Zelda found it both endearing and exasperating, but she understood it came from a place of love and fear of losing what he had found. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, revealing the green earth beneath, Zelda's pregnancy became more obvious. She had to let out her dresses, and the townspeople of Cannon City quickly noticed and began offering advice and gifts for the coming baby. Mrs. Henderson knitted tiny blankets and booties, and the women of the church organized a sewing circle to help Zelda prepare a layette. Owen, meanwhile, began working on expanding the cabin. He built an addition that would serve as a nursery, carefully crafting a cradle from smooth pine wood and sanding it until it was soft as silk. He built shelves for baby things and insisted on stocking up on extra supplies, determined that Zelda and the baby would want for nothing. In late August, as Zelda's time drew near, Owen brought her down to stay in Cannon City, unwilling to risk her giving birth so far from help. Mrs. Henderson happily took them both in, giving them her best room and clucking over Zelda like a mother hen. Owen refused to leave Zelda's side, sleeping in a chair beside the bed, holding her hand through every discomfort. On a warm September evening, Zelda's labor began. The midwife was called, and Owen was banished to the parlor where he paced like a caged animal, listening to the sounds coming from upstairs and feeling utterly helpless. Mrs. Henderson brought him coffee and reassurances, but nothing could calm his fears until, finally, just after dawn, he heard the sound he had been waiting for, the cry of a newborn baby. He took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the room to find Zelda propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. The midwife smiled at him and gestured for him to come closer. "You have a son, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "A healthy, strong boy." Owen approached the bed on shaky legs, his eyes fixed on the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had dark hair and was red-faced from crying, his little fists waving in the air. Owen sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Zelda shifted the bundle into his arms. "Meet your son," she said softly. Owen looked down at the small life he held, and something inside him that had been broken for a very long time suddenly healed. This was his child, his and Zelda's, proof that beauty could come from pain and that the future did not have to be defined by the past. "He is perfect," Owen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What should we name him?" Zelda had been thinking about this for months. "I thought perhaps Thomas, after my father, Thomas Owen Whitmore." Owen looked up at her, understanding the significance of the gesture. She was honoring her past while building their future. "Thomas Owen Whitmore," he repeated. "It is a good, strong name. Hello, Thomas. I am your father, and I promise you right now, I am going to do everything in my power to be the best father I can be." The baby seemed to settle at the sound of his voice, his tiny face relaxing into sleep. Zelda reached out and took Owen's hand, and the three of them sat together in the quiet morning light, a family bound by love and hope. They stayed in Cannon City for 2 weeks while Zelda recovered her strength. And then, Owen brought his wife and son home to the mountain cabin. The journey was taken slowly and carefully, with frequent stops to let Zelda rest and nurse the baby. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Zelda felt a rush of emotion at seeing their home again. Owen had made good use of his trips back and forth over the past weeks. The nursery was complete and furnished, with the cradle positioned near the window where morning light would stream in. He had stocked the cabin with extra firewood and provisions, and everything was clean and ready for their arrival. Life settled into a new rhythm, this one punctuated by the baby's needs. Zelda had to give up teaching for a while, unable to make the journey to town with an infant, but she found she did not mind. Thomas was an easy baby, content to nurse and sleep, and watching Owen with their son filled her heart to overflowing. Owen proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with the tiny boy. He would walk the floor with Thomas when he fussed, singing old cavalry songs in his deep voice until the baby quieted. He changed diapers without complaint and sat for hours just watching his son sleep, as if he could not quite believe this miracle was real. As autumn turned to winter and then winter to spring, Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby who laughed at his father's silly faces and reached for everything within his grasp. Zelda returned to teaching part-time when Thomas was 6 months old, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse where he would sleep in a basket while she taught. The students adored having a baby in their classroom and took turns helping to watch him during recess. On their second wedding anniversary, Owen and Zelda stood together on the outcropping where he had first told her he loved her. Thomas was strapped to Owen's back in a carrier he had fashioned, contentedly chewing on his fist. The valley spread out below them, green with summer growth, and the mountains rose majestic against the blue sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Owen asked. "Giving up your Boston life for this?" Zelda looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Owen, you and Thomas are everything to me. This life we have built together, this is all I ever wanted, even when I did not know it was what I was looking for." Owen shifted Thomas's weight slightly and pulled Zelda close with his free arm. "I used to think I did not deserve happiness after what I did in the wars. That I should spend my life alone as some kind of penance. But you showed me that redemption is possible, that we can move beyond our mistakes and build something good." "We all deserve happiness," Zelda said firmly, "and forgiveness, especially from ourselves." They stood together watching the sun begin its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Thomas gurgled happily from his perch on Owen's back, and Zelda felt a completeness that went soul deep. She had been lost once, frightened and alone in the wilderness. But Owen had found her, and in finding each other, they had both found their way home. 2 years later, Zelda gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Owen's mother. Sarah proved to be as different from her brother as possible, colicky and demanding where Thomas had been easy and content. But Owen and Zelda navigated the challenges together, taking turns walking the floor at night and supporting each other through the exhaustion. Thomas, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Owen would take him outside to give Zelda some quiet time with the baby, teaching him to ride on a gentle old mare and showing him how to track rabbits in the snow. The bond between father and son was strong and deep, built on hours spent together in the wilderness Owen loved. As the children grew, the cabin rang with laughter and sometimes with tears, but always with love. Zelda continued to teach, though she reduced her hours further, wanting to be present for her children's early years. Owen's trapping business thrived, and he began raising cattle in the lower valleys, building a solid financial foundation for their family. On summer evenings, they would all walk down to the stream, where Owen would teach the children to fish while Zelda sat on the bank with her mending or a book. Thomas would wade in the water, squealing when he caught his first trout, while Sarah toddled along the bank, collecting smooth stones and pretty leaves. These were the moments Zelda treasured most, the simple everyday joys of family life. She would watch Owen with their children, his face lit with love and patience, and marvel at how far they had both come from the broken, lonely people they had been. The years passed in this way, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's growth. Thomas started school at 6, riding down the mountain with his mother 3 days a week. Sarah proved to be a wild child, more interested in climbing trees and chasing animals than sitting still for lessons, but she had a tender heart and a fierce loyalty to her family. When Thomas was 8 and Sarah was 5, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder, and Owen insisted she stop teaching entirely, bringing in a replacement teacher from Denver. Zelda chafed at the restriction but understood his concern, especially when she began having contractions early. Their third child, a son they named James, arrived a month before his due date, small but healthy. Owen held the tiny boy with the same wonder he had shown with Thomas, and watching him introduce Sarah and Thomas to their new brother, Zelda felt her heart might burst with the fullness of her love for this man and the family they had created. Life with 3 children was chaotic and exhausting, but never dull. The cabin echoed with noise and activity from dawn to dusk. Owen built additional sleeping lofts to accommodate their growing family and talked about adding another room. Zelda managed the household with efficient grace, though there were days when she collapsed into bed so tired she could barely move. Through it all, she and Owen made time for each other. They would steal moments alone after the children were asleep, sitting together on the porch and watching the stars, talking about their days and their dreams. Their love had deepened over the years, growing from the passionate romance of their early days into something steadier and more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering commitment. When Thomas turned 12, Owen began teaching him the skills he would need to survive in the wilderness: tracking, hunting, reading the weather, navigating by stars and landmarks. Thomas proved an apt pupil, with his father's quiet competence and his mother's quick intelligence. Sarah, now 9, insisted on learning everything her brother learned, and Owen indulged her, recognizing that his daughter had inherited his independent spirit. James, at 4, was the family peacemaker, gentle and sweet-natured, always trying to smooth over conflicts between his siblings. He adored his mother and would follow her around the cabin, chattering endlessly and helping with whatever tasks she would allow. As the children grew more independent, Zelda began teaching again, this time bringing all 3 children with her. The schoolhouse in Cannon City had expanded, and there was talk of building a proper school building. Zelda served on the committee planning the project, her years of experience making her a valued voice in the discussions. Owen, meanwhile, had become a respected figure in the community despite his preference for solitude. Men sought his advice on surviving mountain winters and tracking game. When conflicts arose, people often turned to him as a mediator, trusting his fairness and wisdom. He never sought these roles, but he accepted them as part of being a member of the community, no longer the hermit who lived alone on the mountain. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Owen surprised Zelda with a gift: a beautiful piece of land in the valley, close enough to town for easy access but with enough acreage to raise cattle and horses. He had been quietly saving money for years, planning this surprise. "I thought maybe it was time," he said as they stood together surveying the property. "The children are getting older, and they might want opportunities the mountain cannot give them. And you have sacrificed so much to live up there with me. This way, we can have the best of both worlds." Zelda was moved to tears by his thoughtfulness. "Owen, you did not have to do this. I love our cabin. I love our life." "I know you do, but I want to give you choices. We can build here and keep the cabin as a retreat, or we can stay where we are. It is up to you." They decided to build a house on the new property. A larger home with room for their growing family and space for Zelda to have a proper study where she could work on the curriculum she was developing for the school. Owen designed the house himself, incorporating all the lessons he had learned from years of mountain living. It would be sturdy and well insulated, with large windows to let in light and a wide porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. The whole family threw themselves into the project. Thomas, now 13, worked alongside his father, learning carpentry and construction. Sarah helped her mother plan the interior spaces, showing a surprising aptitude for design. Even young James contributed, hauling small loads of lumber and holding tools for his father. The house took 2 years to complete, built slowly and carefully with materials hauled from the sawmill in Cannon City. When it was finally finished, in the spring of their 12th year of marriage, the Whitmore family moved in with great ceremony. They had a small gathering with friends from town, and Reverend Matthews came to bless the new home, but they kept the mountain cabin too, just as Owen had promised. Several times a year, they would pack up and spend a week or two in their original home, away from the bustle of town life. Those times became sacred to all of them, a return to the simple rhythms that had defined their early years as a family. As the years continued to pass, the children grew into young adults. Thomas developed into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's love of learning. At 18, he announced his intention to study veterinary medicine, having developed a passion for animal care. Owen and Zelda were proud beyond measure, though Zelda worried about him traveling to Denver for his education. Sarah, at 15, was beautiful and headstrong, drawing the attention of several young men in town. But she showed no interest in settling down, declaring she wanted to see more of the world before choosing a path. Owen saw so much of himself in her independent spirit, and while it sometimes led to clashes, he understood her need to forge her own way. James, now 11, remained the family's gentle soul. He showed an aptitude for art, spending hours sketching the landscapes and wildlife around their home. Zelda encouraged this talent, ordering supplies from Denver and framing his best work to hang in their house. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Owen took Zelda back to the spot in the woods where he had first found her all those years ago. They had not been there since that fateful day, but Owen had never forgotten the location. "This is where it all began," he said, standing in the small clearing that looked much as it had that autumn afternoon. "This is where I found the greatest treasure of my life." Zelda looked around at the trees that had seemed so threatening that day and now felt almost friendly. "I was so frightened," she remembered. "I thought I was going to die alone in these woods, and then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not even known how to pray." Owen took both her hands in his. "We have built a good life together, have we not?" "The best life," Zelda agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible. Owen, you gave me everything. A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me yourself, and that was the greatest gift of all." "You did the same for me," Owen said. "Before you, I was just surviving, hiding from my past and my pain. You taught me it was possible to live again, to love again, to hope for the future. Everything good in my life came from you." They kissed there in the clearing where their story had begun. Two people who had been lost and had found each other, who had built a life of love and purpose from the ashes of their separate sorrows. And around them, the forest whispered its approval, the same trees that had witnessed Zelda's terror now bearing witness to their enduring love. The years that followed brought the natural changes and challenges of life. Thomas graduated from veterinary school and returned to Cannon City to establish his practice, eventually marrying a kind schoolteacher named Elizabeth. Sarah did travel, spending 2 years in California before returning home, changed by her experiences but still fundamentally herself. She eventually married a newspaper editor and became a journalist, writing articles about life in the Colorado Territory. James continued with his art, gaining recognition for his paintings of Western landscapes. Owen and Zelda became grandparents 5 times over, and they embraced this new phase of life with the same love and commitment they had brought to everything else. Their home became a gathering place for the extended family, especially during holidays. The sound of children's laughter once again filled the rooms, though now it was their grandchildren racing through the halls. As they grew older, Owen's hair turned silver, and lines deepened around his eyes from years of squinting against the mountain sun. Zelda's dark hair showed streaks of gray, and her hands grew rougher from decades of work. But to each other, they remained as beautiful as they had been on their wedding day. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the house for a celebration. Thomas and Elizabeth brought their 3 children. Sarah and her husband came from Denver with their daughter. James, still unmarried but content with his art, organized the whole event. As Owen and Zelda sat together watching their children and grandchildren interact, Zelda leaned against Owen's shoulder with a contented sigh. "Can you believe it has been 25 years? Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Owen replied. "Other times it feels like you have always been part of my life. I cannot remember what it was like before you. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not found me that day?" Owen was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "I try not to. The thought of you lost and alone, of never having met you, is too painful. I prefer to be grateful for what we have rather than dwelling on what might have been." "Wise man," Zelda said with a smile. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet once more, Owen and Zelda walked out to the porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. In the distance, they could see the outline of the peaks where their cabin still stood, waiting for their next visit. "Zelda," Owen said, taking her hand, "I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. You took a broken man and made him whole. You gave me a family and a purpose. You showed me that redemption is real and that the future can be better than the past." Zelda squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears. "And you, Owen Whitmore, you saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me a home when I was adrift. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You built this beautiful life with me, brick by brick, day by day. I could not have asked for a better partner, a better husband, a better father for my children." They stood together in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, hearts beating in sync after 25 years of marriage. Behind them, their house glowed with warm light. Before them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. And between, they had built a life of love and meaning that would outlast them both, carried forward in the hearts and memories of their children and grandchildren. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. They lost friends to age and illness, watched the town of Cannon City grow from a small frontier settlement into a thriving community. They saw Colorado Territory become a state in 1876, and they watched as the wild country they loved slowly became more settled and civilized. But through it all, their love remained constant, a touchstone they could both rely on. They grew old together, their bodies slowing but their hearts still young. They took walks together every evening, weather permitting, usually ending up on the porch to watch the sunset. They still talked for hours, never running out of things to say to each other. When Owen turned 60, he finally sold off most of his cattle operation, keeping just enough animals for their own needs. He wanted to spend his remaining years focused on what mattered most, family and the land he loved. Thomas had taken over much of the heavy work, but Owen still did what he could, refusing to become completely sedentary. Zelda, now 58, had retired from teaching but remained active in the community, serving on various committees and mentoring new teachers. She also worked on writing a memoir, wanting to record the story of their life for future generations. On a crisp autumn day much like the one when they had first met, Owen suggested they take a ride up to the cabin. They had not been there in several months, and he wanted to check on the place. Zelda agreed readily, always happy to return to their mountain retreat. The ride took longer than it used to, their aging bodies not as resilient as they once were. But they finally reached the cabin as the sun reached its zenith. Everything was just as they had left it, peaceful and welcoming. They spent the afternoon together, walking the familiar trails, visiting the outcropping where Owen had first declared his love, sitting by the stream where they had spent so many evenings with their young children. As the day waned and the air grew cool, they built a fire in the cabin's fireplace and settled into their old chairs. "You remember that first night?" Zelda asked, watching the flames dance. "When you brought me here after finding me lost in the woods?" "Every detail," Owen said. "You were so brave, trying not to cry even though you were terrified. I knew right then you were someone special." "I was terrified," Zelda admitted. "But I also felt safe with you, even though I had no reason to trust a stranger. Something in me recognized you, I think. Recognized that you were going to be important to me." Owen reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of veins and age spots. "You were lost and I found you, but the truth is, I was just as lost as you were. I had just been wandering in the wilderness for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to have a destination. You gave me that. You gave me a reason to find my way home." "We found our way together," Zelda said, "and what a journey it has been." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire and holding hands. Two people who had weathered decades together and whose love had only deepened with time. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its call echoing through the mountains. As they prepared for bed that night, moving with the careful slowness of age, Zelda paused to look out the window at the starlit landscape. Owen came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For finding me, for loving me, for this life we have built together, for everything." Owen kissed the top of her head. "The honor was mine, Mrs. Whitmore, today, tomorrow, and always." They climbed into bed, the same bed where they had spent their wedding night all those years ago, and fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful for another day together and hopeful for all the days still to come. Owen and Zelda Whitmore lived many more years together, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. They never stopped loving each other, never stopped finding joy in the simple fact of being together. When Zelda passed away peacefully at the age of 78, with Owen holding her hand and their entire family gathered around, her last words were, "Thank you for finding me." Owen followed her 2 years later, his heart finally giving out as he sat on the porch of their mountain cabin, watching the sunset over the peaks he had loved for so long. His children found him there, peaceful and content, a slight smile on his face as if he could see something beautiful just beyond their sight. They buried him next to Zelda in the cemetery overlooking Cannon City under a simple headstone that read Owen Whitmore, beloved husband and father, 1848–1928. And next to it, Zelda Whitmore, beloved wife and mother, 1856–1934. But to those who knew them, they needed no marker. Their legacy lived on in the family they had created, in the community they had served, and in the enduring example of their love. The mountain cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations, a reminder of where it all began. And on certain autumn evenings when the light hits just right and the wind whispers through the pines, you can almost see them there. A tall man on a buckskin horse, finding a lost woman in the woods, and leading her not just to shelter but home to his heart, where she belonged all along. Their story became legend in Cannon City, told and retold to new generations. The tale of the schoolteacher who got lost in the mountains and the cowboy who found her, and how they built a life together that spanned more than half a century. It became a reminder that sometimes being lost is how we find exactly where we are meant to be, and that love can bloom even in the harshest wilderness, growing strong and true if tended with care and devotion. And so the story ends not with an ending at all, but with a continuation. The love Owen and Zelda shared rippled outward through time, touching everyone they knew and everyone who came after. Their great-great-grandchildren still gather at the mountain cabin for family reunions, still walk the trails Owen once showed Zelda, still tell the story of how it all began on that fateful autumn day in 1878, when she was lost in the woods. The mountain cowboy found her and led her home to his heart where she would remain forever.